Well, I think we'll get started. My name is Rob Slifkin, and I'm a professor here at the Institute of Fine Arts, as well as the Director of Graduate Studies and Deputy Director this year. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Institute for those who have never been here before. This is the graduate art history program of NYU, and this is our, fifth, Sarah? Fifth Aperture Institute of Fine Arts photo assembly. And on behalf of Sarah Maestre and myself, I'm so happy you could all join us in what is a new venue for us. We're trying a new space that's we're hoping is a little more informal and colloquial, and will really invite conversation, because that is really at the heart of what we're trying to achieve with these events. So I'm really here just to welcome you, and I'm going to now send it over to Brendan Ender, who is the senior editor of Aperture, who will introduce tonight's event.
How's the volume levels? I'm Brendan Emser. I'm a senior editor at Aperture, and it's really a pleasure to be here tonight, and also somewhat intimidatingly within this esteemed company. I've had the great pleasure of working over the last year with David on a book that will soon come out from Aperture, which is also the raison d'etre of our family gathering this evening at the IFA. I will just give you a short introduction about what we're going to soon hear. In 1935, Walker Evans was commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art to photograph hundreds of African sculptures for the exhibition called African Negro Art. Nearly 90 years later, the artist David Alekhuogie, here at the table with us, began investigating Evans' images, provocatively remixing them into his own vibrant and multi-layered photographic collages. So the image that we're looking at on the screen is actually the cover of David's book, A Reprise, which will be published by Aperture this summer, and will also be part of an exhibition in New York in the fall. Is that right, Yancy?
Yes.
Yes, okay. You heard it here first. And it's a really special book that is playing upon two major exhibitions, one in, as I said, in 1935, and one in 2000 at the Met, which is forming the kind of palimpsest cover in this complex design object that you will all encounter, I hope, this summer. David is drawing upon the musical idiom of the reprise, a performance of repetition, and staking a claim to the crucial restorative ideas around Black antiquity by questioning our relationship to what we consider fake or original art or archive. And I wanted to recognize that there are three absolutely brilliant contributors to this book who have created a discourse around this body of work and opened our eyes and minds in wonderful ways. Zoë Hopkins, who interviews David and kind of goes into his mind and thought process and opens up a lot of his ideas, both personal and artistic. Wendy Grossman, who takes us back in time to the 1930s period when African Negro art was presented at MoMA. And Wills Glassspiegel, who is riffing on the idea of the jazz idiom of reprise and thinking about how we can read David's work through music and sound and performance. So a lot to feast upon, I think, when the book comes out. Our panelists tonight are David, Zoë, and Drew Sawyer, and Prita Meier will give them a proper introduction, but they're all part of the Aperture family in one way or another, and it's been a real treat to collaborate with them, not only on this book, but on other past and future Aperture projects. For those of you who are not familiar with Aperture, hoping there are some first-time people here this evening, Aperture is a nonprofit publisher that leads conversations around photography around the world. Aperture was established in 1952 to advance the creative thinking significantly expressed in words and photographs. Aperture champions photography's vital role in nurturing curiosity and encouraging a more just, tolerant society. The Institute of Fine Arts, our partner in these programs, and again, this is the fifth such photo assembly, is a thriving center of advanced research and graduate teaching in art history, archaeology, and art conversation. A site of knowledge production since its founding in 1932, the Institute has also produced many of the world's leading art historians, museum directors, curators, and conservators. Tonight's conversation will be followed by a reception in the Great Hall, so we hope you'll stick around and informally chat with your fellow participants, community members here. So without further ado, an introduction to our moderator this evening, the esteemed Prita Meier, who is an associate professor of art history at the Institute of Fine Arts here at New York University. Prita Meier holds a PhD from Harvard University and is an Africanist art and architectural historian who looks at visual culture and the built space through the lenses of circulation, empire, and globalization. And I've just learned that her magnum opus, which is called The Surface of Things, A History of Photography from the Swahili Coast, has just been published. So major congratulations to you, Prita. I'll now hand it over and look forward to this lively conversation.
So we're playing musical chairs here. So I'm really just honored and delighted to first introduce you all and then start us off in our conversation. So David Alekhuogie is a Los Angeles-based photographer whose work critically engages with issues of the construction of identity and the legacies of colonialism through both documentary and conceptual approaches. In his series, A Reprise, which of course we're going to talk about at length, which does many things, including really also challenging received ideas about the authenticity and authority of the photographic archive. And prior to that, his work has been featured in major exhibitions at MoMA, at the California African American Museum, and other major group exhibitions at the High Museum of Art, Frankel Gallery, and the Regan Projects. He has also had many solo exhibitions, including at Commonwealth and Council, the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery, and the Chicago Artists Coalition. His work has been published in Aperture, Foam, The New Yorker, the New York Times, and he's received several major awards for emerging artists. Zoë Hopkins, here to my left, who is also, as had already been mentioned, as one of the contributors to this book, is a writer and critic here in New York, whose work centers on conceptual art, photography, and new media in the Black diaspora. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, Frieze, Art Review, and the Brooklyn Rail, among other places. And she's been recognized by major fellowships, including from the Gordon Parks Foundation and the Modern Ancient Brown Foundation. She's currently pursuing a MA in Modern and Contemporary Art at Columbia University, where she is also the 2025 Wallach Curatorial Fellow. And then, of course, Drew Sawyer is an art historian and curator of photography at the Whitney Museum of Art. His most recent book and exhibition is Copy Machine Manifestos, Artists Who Make Zines. And he told me he's just very hard at work right now on the biennial, right? And he just came back from various artist studio visits, right? In upstate New York. So prior to his role at the Whitney, he's held curatorial positions at the Brooklyn Museum and at MoMA. He holds a PhD in art history from Columbia University and was the recipient of the Association of Art Museum Curators Award of Excellence. So a very interesting panel. And I'll get us started off with asking a couple of questions. And the most important aspect of our gathering today is that we engage the audience, and that it's really important that you feel free to ask questions of the artist and our other panelists. But I'll start with a question which perhaps won't surprise you at all, because of course I know the Walker Evans photo project as an Africanist art historian, and I've taught it in seminars, but always in relationship to the role African art plays in primitivism. So my question comes from that. The show from 1935 was curated by James Sweeney, And it was really in the United States, the first time that African sculpture was really presented as art, as opposed to ethnographic artifacts. And of course, it's celebrated for being this major instance where our African visual culture was seen for the first time differently, at least by US audiences. But the way that the exhibition, and certainly also Walker Evans's photograph, does it is through a deeply modernist and of course formalist lens, stripping the works of their cultural context, never asking who the artists in Africa were, of course, who made these objects, right? And the exhibition arranged them by geography, which in some ways was very ethnographic, and really ultimately reinforcing a colonialist hierarchy of aesthetics. Evans's photographs were, of course, very elegant, right? Very seductive, but of course, also troubling, right? The way they're tightly cropped, highly controlled studio images. They become a visual record of the objects, but of course, they were also taken through oftentimes violent means from these from Africa, right? And as an aside, actually, Robert Goldwater, who's like known as the father of thinking of modernist primitivism, also worked on the exhibition as an assistant, actually, as a research assistant. And he also, of course, well, maybe you don't know, interestingly, he got his PhD from the IFA. So the IFA also plays a role in this story. And taught here and produced PhD students here. Yes. So interesting connection. So I guess my first question will be, I'll start with you, David. So what does it mean for contemporary artists or contemporary curators and art critics to engage this kind of archive, right? Which is both so seductive, but also visually or historically violent in some ways, right? How do you approach the material in Reprise? What kinds of questions or tensions did you want to surface through your reworking of Evans's images?
So I think to think about how me and my peers have approached a lot of this work is a lot of it has been through this kind of broken history that like feels like it's kind of a part of our, somewhat, at least like a lot of the peers that I have that, are African American or maybe African American and African, maybe children of African immigrants. There's a sort of Pan-African kind of omnipresent history that you sort of grow up with in the household, and I was interested in all of the different signifiers to a lot of that historic work that were, maybe replicas or fakes or inspired by, and that being kind of a part of how you exist culturally in the country altogether. So a lot of it is through like something that feels familial, even though it really isn't, and then for me to approach it knowing a lot of the art historical side, being really familiar with the history of Evans' work, being familiar with a lot of post-colonial scholarship independently from art history as well, sort of grappling with a lot of the gaps between how that work is written about, perceived, and championed, both in the art world as well as in pop culture, like one of the things that coming into this building that I thought about was that fantastic scene in Black Panther where he like comes into what feels like, a space that is, and it's somewhat, it triggers a kind of retribution, for what you feel like belongs to your sort of cultural narrative, but that is like now kind of diffuse into pop culture, you know? Yeah, I think that a lot of it for me is about balancing a lot of those things. Like, is it, this kind of critical engagement with what feels like the spoils of colonialism, or is it this kind of love letter to aesthetics that feel familiar to me? I think it's both. And I think that a lot of when I think about the work, both whether it's like film or poetry or music that really gets under my skin, it addresses both of those things.
So did the archive these photos of African sculpture by Evans get under your skin in some way?
Yes.
Can you maybe
Yes.
talk a little bit about that? How?
Because they're beautiful. They feel familiar. They remind me of home, but in a lot of ways,
But all the way.
they're wrapped in, all of this kind of this what feels like they almost feel like game trophies, like animals that like what do you call it? Where they stuff the animals,
Taxidermy.
taxidermy,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah.
and so.
Didn't you bring some images? Wasn't there some images that you want to maybe briefly show us, like how you intervene in the archive?
Sure, there's
Because most of us, of course, haven't seen. Right?
so these
Is
are
this-
some of the earlier works, some of my
Yeah, can you
earlier.
maybe- yeah.
Yeah, sure. So we can either go straight into the African sculpture work, or I had started making this work around the time when I came across this album by Aretha Franklin called Amazing Grace, and for me, it reminds me of my mother a lot. It's like one of my mother's albums. I discovered it was my mother's album, and I was like very familiar with the music, but I wasn't as familiar with the performance and the aesthetics and the album cover, and what felt like, this opportunity to use what is a song, Amazing Grace, which is actually, we sort of think of it as a, like a song that really belongs to the history of like Black American culture, but it's not even like an American song, and it sort of ebbs and flows through history, being this kind of funerary song, oftentimes in the context of the civil rights movement. So it's like this opportunity to take what is essentially a script. I think about, at least at this point, to acknowledge Evans as a script for how to do documentary photography, and I'm essentially performing that script in a completely new way, akin to like a jazz musician. And for me, the sort of progression of jazz to hip hop and the remix as kind of belonging to different generations, angles of entrance into music. So that's why I've been like so interested in Amazing Grace. And this is Barack's version of Amazing Grace, which was really, really, it was amazing and triggering and emotional and sad, and was a sort of exercise in collective prayer, is what I sort of think of it, regardless of whether this is a religious song or not. This kind of reanimation of something that is part of our history in a way that speaks to certain people, so, and this is an example Elvis Presley's Amazing Grace and Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace. This is a photograph of my mom and very sort of like similar garb, which I thought was like really interesting. This is like one of the pieces from the book. And also, so I taught a class. A lot of this work, a lot of the sort of thinking methodology behind the work came out of a class that I was teaching at the time at CalArts, titled Archives in Practice, which was a critical read of archive fever. You know, I had had this assigned to me in graduate school, you know, under a few different, you know, contexts, but there was never a sort of critical page by page read of this work. And one of the sort of takeaways that I had was this idea that at least my relationship with photography as, you know, picturing the dead, you know, picturing what is already gone, you know, and this idea in archive fever is sort of speaking to this fact that, you know, and this is something that we're even noticing in the everyday today, is the fact that history is like a moving target, you know, the sort of language will shift around us. In fact, I feel like culture and language is shifting around us as we speak. You know, I think that in the coming years, you know, you won't even be able to use terms like diversity and inclusion.
That's right.
Right. You know, and so I feel like we remember what we perform. So even though Walker Evans images exist in this context, I feel like they rely on a sort of reinterpretation to be kept alive, you know, even if they are these kind of spoils of colonialism. So, and this is what was a really kind of formative book for me, you know, the Peter Hujar book on the Susan Sontag quote. And this, you know, it's funny. I feel like, you know, and this is obviously, this is like the George Floyd incident, and this is the Society of the Spectacle cover. And I have been lately thinking about whether I make work in bad times and sell work in good times or something, you know, because I'm feeling under duress again, you know, and this is like some of the images that were in my home. So I originally had started making images in my home, and I have like group chats with various artists that I'm sure a lot of you would know. We sort of just share images of like things that we're thinking about.
Did you get this in Kenya?
This belonged to my parents.
Okay.
They brought it from Kenya.
Okay.
You know, these are some of the just the stuff, you know, in my home. So I sort of think of this as like, you know, Black still life. I've always wanted to curate a show on like modern Black still life. There's a picture of my grandparents, which feels like a c'est du que to picture.
Yes, I thought that what it was actually.
You know, so. And, you know, I'd started to do Google searches, you know, as a way to figure out algorithmically what African aesthetics look like. I was sort of curious as to what are the sort of expectations that people have when it comes to Black people in America, you know, because it seems like there is a sort of expectation to perform those scripts, and I was interested in what they were. So I started to do these Google searches, and Walker Evans started to pop up, you know, and then I started to work in the studio. You know, this is, you know, how I start to work. You know, these are some of the images that were on like my laptop. You know, that top right photograph is like a photograph that was made by one of my good friends, Awal Risku, where he cut this kind of Pan-African flag into my head. You know, a lot of his like work is centered on these sort of signs and symbols. But it's just a sort of example of the idea that these ideas are sort of, you know, omnipresent, existing in all of our sort of psyche, you know, simultaneously. And we're all sort of approaching them differently. And this kind of question of ethnography has been at the forefront, as well as the question around primitivism that you brought up in this kind of history of modernist painting, you know, what modernist painting owes to African sculpture and sort of African art history altogether. And I think it was David Campney actually who really, I had met with him and we had sort of started to talk about these two, because at first I was really, really more interested in the Met exhibition, you know, and then I had become more interested in the Walker Evans, this specific African Negro art exhibitions, you know, so. And yeah, I'll just show you some of the process of how I start to work. These are, you know, either scans or photographs, and then they are sort of end up being these, what I imagine that the sculpture could be, you know, or a sort of version of that sculpture in my own space. Just like how a lot of them are inspired. So in a lot of the photographs, I'm reintegrating them back into the context of this piece of archival text, you know, open for interpretation again for maybe like another performer, you know, is what I've been interested in. So some of them, they're just photographs, and some of them they're reintegrated back into the book, and you can sort of like see a lot of the notes from where these images come from. That's like another thing that's been interesting to me is this sort of the demystification of like an image, you know, this idea that, because I consider myself like a working class artist. Like the idea that like I relate to a printmaker or like a framer or like a art handler, you know, the sort of invisible hands of how a thing is made. So I'm always looking for opportunities to at least force a sort of investment in the sort of process of making things seen. So this is one of my favorite photographs. It's one of my sister's favorite photographs as well, because these are two men that I met in Kenya on safari during what was a bush breakfast. So there's a tradition on the bush and where you have bush breakfast, you know, and this is a safari that this tribe specifically like owns, you know, and so they make all the sort of proceeds from these safaris. But in the past, you know, if you like look at like images from bush breakfasts, like in history, they're very much sort of like in the background, oftentimes in their traditional garb, you know. And so that's why this was titled Post-Colonial Bush Breakfast. Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Because I actually want to make sure that because of Zoe, and you also have actually some initial remarks to also sort of engage your work, and then we can continue our conversation with the audience. Yeah. You want to go?
Great, yeah. Which mic should I?
Oh, probably that one.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you for that. It's also fabulous. This is our first time meeting in person. Yeah, we had our interview over Zoom. So this has just been a really exciting evening. Prita, as you were framing the Evans photographs and speaking about the kind of formal universe which they inhabit, which is one of really close cropping, kind of intensely frontal, the word that comes to mind for me always in thinking about those photographs is alienated. And you can feel with such thickness and intensity, the alienation and theft of those objects when you look at the photographs and the kind of compositional grammar which they inhabit. And so that set me to thinking about, those of us who are physically and psychically alienated from the kind of ancestral origin that is the continent of Africa. And I was thinking alongside David's work about artists in the Black diaspora who are making use of African art to reconcile with questions of alienation and dispossession and dislocation. So with that, I want to make 2 quick points before really beginning. So, the call here was to sort of think about how Western authorship interacts with African art. And I just want to slightly modify this question and ask, how does the violent touch of the West reauthor African artwork and reconfigure the terms within which it is read for diasporic subjects? And second, my presentation does not adopt a definition of Western that is synonymous or reducible to whiteness. I also include in this definition of Westernness, Black Americanness, which is on the one hand a constitutive negation of the universal Western subject, but on the other hand, necessarily a product of Western modernity. And also, I should say, I'm bending the rules a little bit. I'm talking about film for a second. I know this is a photo thing, but just for a second. Quote, "I'm a prisoner here. I'm their prisoner. I don't know anyone here. No one here is my family. That's why I'm their slave." Here I'm quoting Diana, the young protagonist of Ousmane Sembène's 1966 film, Black Girl, or La Noire de. In the still on screen, she lays her hands on the wall in her white French employer's home and turns to look at us, defiance and self-possession blazing in her eyes. She's in Antibes, where the French family has brought her to work as a household nanny, as a household maid and nanny for the children, sundering her from her family, her lover, and her world back home in Dakar. Ensconced and shielded between her hands is a mask, which Diana herself purchased for 50 francs earlier in the film when she was still home in Senegal. She brought it to her employers as a gift when they were still living in Dakar. There, the mask was displayed alongside other West African sculptures, with it, which the French family had presumably purchased in Senegal. Now, having traveled to Antibes, where she spends the film sort of descending into misery, loneliness, and hatred of her employers, the mask hangs on a white wall, exposed and vulnerable, a mark of naked loneliness. What has this mask, this emphatically solitary vestige of her home, become for Diana? With what new eyes does this young Black girl look upon this piece of Senegal now that she finds herself in the land of its colonizers? We are wont to think about African art that has been made to live inside the Western exhibitionary complex, where they are largely severed from African eyes. And of course, the Walker Evans project was born out of precisely that arrangement. But what becomes of African art objects and the African eye in a context like Diana's, a context where her cultural heritage is with her, but also shadowed by all that which she has been made to live without, present but rippling with absences. The psychogeography of the West not only redraws the map of Diana's interior, it also overdetermines and defamiliarizes those objects in her external world that bear the traces of memory and familiarity. Remade and undone by the touch of the West, by its new role as a home decor object for Diana's employers, the mask is made to signify anew. Cast in the bleak light of the colonial metropole, it is hardly a signifier of home for Diana. Rather, it measures her distance from home and the impossibility of returning there. It signifies the brutal enclosure of alienation and the fragmented psychic arena of spatial and social dislocation. The mask, in all of its loneliness, becomes a metonym for Diana herself. It too is imprisoned. It too wrested from its kin. It too is fettered to the unforgivingly isolated wall of whiteness. 14 years before Sembène released Black Girl, Frantz Fanon had published Black Skin, White Masks, For Fanon, the white mask is a metaphor for the extreme dissimulation of Blackness and the performance of westernized habits among Africans and Antilleans aiming to fulfill their, quote, barely veiled desire to assimilate to the colonial world, unquote. I want to ask in turn, what is the African mask as object and as metaphor for the alienated Black, the Black who has been marked and remade by contact with the West? So now I'm curious to visit the other side of the Atlantic and make a lateral shift towards a different figuration of alienated Blackness. So here we're looking at Lorna Simpson's diptych Vantage Point, in which the artist pictures the back of her head next to an African mask, or rather the kind of concaved interior of an African mask, which we might read here as a signifier of her deferred and denied ancestral heritage. And a gesture quite typical of Simpson's early photographic work, the face, that locus where identity is sutured and stabilized, is doubly refused from the viewer. Beneath the diptych are two plaques reading inside and outside on the left and the right. The words point most obviously to the content of the image. So we have the concave interior of the mask and the exterior of Simpson's back, which locates us outside of any access to her interior. But also the title seems to evoke the psychic and metaphysical involutions and transpositions that attend Black life in a white Western context. Indeed, a life lived in natal alienation turns the psyche and the spirit inside out. The interior is left longing for the ancestral, but always circumscribed and displaced by lived relation to the reality of the external world, one which is overdetermined by whiteness. And here in Flipside, we see the kind of like violent reckoning with that external world in the plaque beneath, which reads, "The neighbors were suspicious of her hairstyle," suggesting a kind of irreparable feeling of distance from those who texture and shape Simpson's wealth. This is Lyle Ashton Harris's Zambelli at Land's End. Should just flip between these two. So these are both taken in Sayville, which is, not far from here, a queer haven in Fire Island, New York. And it's from a series called Flash of the Spirit, titled after art historian Robert Ferris Thompson's eponymous book, which is largely kind of an endeavor to trace the iterative elaborations of African art and culture in the diaspora. So here we see a nude figure donning an antelope mask and screened by a glass partition, a sort of veil that literally colors our view of the figure as it cuts across the visual field, calling to mind the spliced phenomenal world described by Du Bois in his theorization of double consciousness. Subject and viewer are distantiated from one another as hands press against the glass, as if to both call attention to the presence of this barrier and also rebuke the figure's confinement behind it. It's important to note that Harris is born in New York, but spent much time growing up in Dar es Salaam, and also lived in Accra for 7 years in his adult life. So he's living the experience of this kind of double consciousness of Americanness and Africanness. And the mask also belongs to his uncle, who traveled widely in West Africa during the kind of like peak of revolutionary heat in the 1960s, and collected a lot of art over there. But in these really oniric images, we get a kind of braid of queer performance and gestures of diasporic longing. And also all of it is meeting on this really unstable ground of vision, this multiplanar composition of visuality in which we are made to reckon with the prismatic fragmentation of a gaze that is rigorously mediated by dislocation, dispossession, and alienation. The promise of a, quote, return to origins is held on Harris's side of the glass, and just beyond it, the world itself. There is a world of difference, of course, between Joanna, a young housemaid, and Harris and Simpson, who are well-established artists, and Joanna, who is Senegalese, and Harris and Simpson, who are both born in the United States. But what we do get is a kind of through line wherein in both Gianna's view from the stranglehold of colonial power and Harris's and Simpson's view from the anoriginary Blackness born of the longue durée of slavery, the mask figures as a sign of longing and alienation, as a presence that also indexes an absence. I began this presentation with the question of how the West reauthors African art objects, but in tracing the continuities between these scenes, we can perhaps open onto the question of how Blackness and the defiant critical posture born of its alienation asks us to contaminate again that reauthoring or reorient the direction of Western interventions on the image. And so, yeah, I mean, I think in thinking alongside David's work, the three authors that I've brought to the stage here might point us in some kind of direction of continuity. And yeah, thanks.
We're going to make a pivot a little bit. So I think my participation in tonight's discussion is no doubt stems from my scholarship on Walker Evans, on which I wrote my dissertation. So it's interesting to revisit something I was deep in about 10 years ago, but haven't really touched in about a decade. So yeah, it was fun kind of revisiting that and thinking about it again in relation to David's work in particular, who I got to have a conversation with now, yeah, 5 years ago, maybe during the pandemic, early pandemic. But my dissertation really looked at or reconsidered the kind of widely used term documentary style into Evans's various contexts of employment throughout his career, which would include the commission for MoMA in 1935. And one thing I tried to ask was, how do we reconcile the messy realities of work, employment, with the supposed independence of artistic production, especially around the question of authorship or style in photography in particular. And I think, of course, MoMA's commission in 1935 is pretty indicative of the kind of questions I was asking, although it wasn't one of the projects I went so deeply into, in which week I'll hopefully maybe address. But it was really Virginia Lee Webb's 2000 exhibition and book, Perfect Documents, which David engaged with, that reconsidered this body of work that was relatively, up until that point, understudied. And in it, she really argues for this series as art and as part of Evans' overall oeuvre, in addition to providing a lot of really amazing in-depth research into the original exhibition and the portfolio that Evans created. So again, I think it's interesting that you actually go to that 2000 one, because in a way, it was never really considered part of his work up until that point. And in particular, she really uses it to argue for the development of Evans' so-called documentary style, for which he became more well-known a few years later when he had his exhibition and book, American Photographs, also at MoMA in 1938. But that project drew heavily from another concurrent project that he was doing in 1935, which was being employed by the federal government for the resettlement administration, for which, of course, people probably are more familiar with his work. So the term documentary style first appeared actually in 1971, the year of Evans's retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art. And he was asked about his work in relation to this idea of documentary, and Evans famously told Leslie Katz, the interviewer, that, quote, documentary was a very sophisticated and misleading word and not really clear. You have to have a sophisticated ear to receive that word. The term should be documentary style. An example of a literal document would be a police photograph of a murder scene. You see, a document has use, whereas art is really useless. Therefore, art is never a document, though it certainly can adopt that style. Yet, so one of the questions I want to ask tonight, and me thinking about this body of work in particular, is yet the vast majority of Evans's photographs were produced as documents or for utilitarian purposes. Therefore, what does it mean to return these objects, these documents, to the original context of production and distribution, and see how they conform to the specific professional practices in which they were made and consider seriously their style on their own terms rather than through the lens of possessive individualism or kind of artistic practice. You know, and actually Virginia Lee Webb brings in her catalog one earlier example, which is of Charles Sheeler. And she actually wrote an article in the early 90s that compared Evans's photographs with Sheeler's photographs. And she actually spends a lot of time noticing the differences, but I think, you know, at first glance, we can really think about, of course, the similarities between them, the way in which they're photographed against a neutral backdrop, of course, the way they're generally conformed to certain views, such a frontal view, as well as a kind of angled 3/4 view, which is fairly common amongst this type of, you know, museological photography as well. So my argument was that both, right, already conforming to scientific practices around specimen documentation that was established in the 19th century with photography. I quickly, just because I'm worried about time as well, so I'm just going to quickly give just like one example, as I was saying, that is more connected to my previous research, which is Evans's work. Up until the 1936, he was mostly, one way he made money was commissioned or working for architectural survey photography, which also had its kind of standard aesthetic practices. So here is one of his more well-known photographs, which was produced in 1931. And it then became, it would appear in the 1938 exhibition book in American Photographs, and then actually become the cover of a later edition, and was also included in Dan Graham's Homes for America. So it's something that circulated widely beyond the original context, which was an architectural survey of Victorian architecture in the Northeast, mainly in the Boston area, that Lincoln Kirstein and John Brooks Wheelwright, an architectural historian, commissioned Evans to do. It's the first time he uses a large format camera, which was required of architectural photography. And again, his work basically conforms to the standard aesthetic of that genre, including, again, the sort of frontal view, which he then becomes maybe much more well-known for. So you see the example on the right of a home in New Jersey that, again, conforms to the kind of frontal view, as well as the kind of angled view that is more widely used because, of course, it allows you to see more angles of the house or the structure as well. So I guess there's I'm going to skip over a lot of this stuff, but so I think one of the questions I'll just kind of end with then is, as I was saying, what does it mean then to incorporate Evans' 1935 MoMA commission into the conception of his documentary style, or the idea of useful art when he did not represent this material himself? I think, you know, throughout Evans's career, where I would locate authorship or style is the representation of his commissioned images, which almost 99% of everything he photographed was on commission, but it's really the way he would then remix those things together that provided authorship or agency in some ways. So what does it mean that this material, this body of work, he never used, he never represented? And then I also, just to end with the kind of question that people brought up, which got me thinking, it's like, and it's kind of back to this kind of visual violence or alienation that you find, that I think many people find in the photographs, and we might ask if Evans intentionally heightened the sensation through cropping, and if some of these formal choices is where we might also read his own authorship.
Maybe do you want to make some preliminary, like, some responses before we open it up to the audience? Yeah.
I also want to respond to a lot of, you know, what Zoe was saying about Fanon and this concept of double consciousness. And I think specifically as I sit in an institution like this, I think about, you know, the performance of self, my performance of self, you know, as belonging to not only my own instinct, but also a sort of expectation that I'm trying to parse. And, someone else asked me this kind of question about like masks, whether or not I, am sort of functioning similarly to these sculptures in a way as just being maybe I'm wearing a mask in my own right. And it's throughout the sort of course of my entire sort of career, my first sort of introduction to Evan's work, at least in like any sort of scholarly way as like a student at somewhere like Yale, where he's like very much looming in the history of that. There's a sort of the sort of angle of entry that I really want to make specific in my work is the fact that people struggle with trying to be inside and outside. Like I am trying to be inside and outside all the time, I think that for a person who went to, all of these institutions, I'm doing a fellowship at Harvard at the moment, I'm still feeling like I'm outside. And I'm always asking the question, like, once you're inside, how do you like stay inside? Whether or not things like your financial well-being, your health insurance, maybe depend on being inside. And when you're inside, do you have like the space to sort of be critical, to sort of expand the field of the documentary style? Because my whole, manifesto, my whole agenda is to expand the sort of field of documentary style to things like the remix and performance and these things that feel much more in reach of people who are on the margins and who don't have the privilege to just be like, I just work here. You know what I mean? And then to later on be like, actually, I'm an artist. I think that is a privilege. Like nobody's gonna go back and look at the sort of graduation pictures that I made for people and say, oh, like this is art, unless I specifically contextualize them that way. It's just like another project that I'm working on. But anyway, I think that there's overlap here between the sort of black mask thing, or what is it? Is the title black skin, white mask? Yes, there's overlap between that and this kind of concept of the privilege of calling a style documentary or not. Yeah. I guess I'm always just trying to get in. I've been trying to get in Aperture my whole career, trying to get in the MoMA, trying to do this, very much trying to get in, So I think that the approach that I'm making is from the outside, maybe for fear of being eventually kicked out at some point, but I don't know. I think that this is there's a lot of different things we can sort of talk about, in regards to that.
Should we open it up to maybe
Sure.
to the rest of the people in the room? Any questions? Responses? Of your work in book?
There are images. Let me see. Where's the?
These, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
these are some of the images from the book. Let's see. This is one of my favorites. This is maybe my favorite. And yeah, I think that more than documentary photographs, they're photographs of me looking at documentary photographs and feeling alienated by those photographs, feeling as though I have this specific access. There may come a point because, at least at this point in my career, I am an insider. There may come a time where I get to, engage with all of these sort of artifacts, you know, as an insider, but it's not as though I can take those things with me. You know, I'm still a sort of agent within an institution that has commodified and subjugated a culture. And that's why I feel very akin to these sculptures, because I feel like in the same way they're the sort of spoils of colonialism, I'm also the spoils of colonialism, right? And I think like that's like what for me is a sort of engagement with performance as documentation, or the sort of oppositional gaze. For me, this is like a interrogation of the oppositional gaze, what it means to be subject and author at the same time, you know? And I think that people who grow up with this stuff in their house relate to that, relate to it being like about them at the same time they're like making it, you know? And sort of grappling with whether or not, like how familiar they are with their own history, you know, or how much access to it, how they approach it. Yeah, I think that that's what separates my work from Evan's work, at least conceptually, is the fact that I am like an outsider looking at an insider, looking at, you know, it's there's these layers happening that are a part of this this double conscious experience, you know. It's like a part of the Black avant-garde historically in poetry, music, you know, film. So I'm trying to point to that in things that are a little bit less common, you know. I don't think that there is as much of a history of that when it comes to still life photography, but when it comes to, you know, self-portraiture, for example, you know, there's like a long tradition of like self-portraiture and the oppositional gaze, you know. Yeah, I think that you gotta look at the book. How about that?
Sure, please.
And that this one's right here, I'm trying to read it literally. That whole thing's your photograph, but it
Yes.
looks like it's a 3D sculpture.
It started as these different views.
And it looks like the sculpture is casting a shadow,
Mhm.
or is that painted on the blue?
So the blue is the painted backdrop. I started to so for me, it was this idea that if I had started working in the styles of Evans, right, where you have these strong shadows that are being cast by the light, and they're sort of creating these formal moments in the photograph. Because I'm like looking at his work, not just when it comes to the content itself, but also like formally what they look like. And for me, the blue backdrop is a sort of disruption of that sort of premise, you know, that you can that you can, you know, look at a sculpture and only talk about it formally. It sort of like is changing the context, and it's like a gesture of a changing context. Essentially, is like, you know, that's the reason why the backdrop is incomplete, you know, because it's happening in the studio. So, but yeah, I start off as these separate views, and then think about building them in the studio more as like, it's not as though I'm trying to like make an accurate rendition of a thing that maybe Evans had access to. It's more of a process of dealing with the gaps that like I don't have access to, you know, at no attempt, at no point am I attempting to make something that feels,
This is not about recuperation.
yeah, no, it's like prayer essentially, you know, like inviting the viewer to sort of engage in this like process of not really having access to your own, what feels like your own family heirlooms, you know? Yeah, through the lens of Evans, right? Because Evans is, that's the, because I want to keep harping on this idea of like the script, because these photographs bring me a lot of joy. Like DJing brings me a lot of joy, you know? This kind of idea that you could be working in a vein and leaning on all of these things that are embedded in a sort of trauma that you have, and bringing something that feels like joy out of that is like the most, like the super Black thing, you know? And I think like that's what I'll leave it at. So.
Love to, David, when you were speaking so beautifully and pointedly about this, this struggle of being positioned on the outside and the incessant kind of like desire to participate in the inside, it's making me think about the like radical insideness of the sculptures themselves. And there's a scene in Mati Diop's Dahomey, a wonderful film about African sculptures on a kind of journey towards repatriation, but it begins in the basement of the Musée Quai Branly in Paris, and it's just these sculptures inside these cages, essentially. And it reminds me so much of, you know, we've been talking about the term documentary, and it reminds me so much of, you know, the early kind of co-constitutive relationship between documentary photography and photographs that were taken for criminological purposes of incarcerated people in prisons. And so the photographic the photographic document has in some ways been a discourse of insideness, of positioning people on an inside from which they cannot escape. And, you know, Evans is doing in many ways a similar thing with these objects at MoMA, which are confined to those premises and that kind of scope of being. And then David, in your photographs, what happens is that kind of like insideness and imprisonment expands and is reconfigured as depth and three-dimensionality, and like the shadows that you brought up earlier are precisely a way of articulating a kind of depth and a livingness and an almost character. Like it feels like the sculptures become kind of or your photograph becomes character studies of these sculptures, a way of bringing them into the world as I don't want to say reanimated objects necessarily, but that three-dimensionality feels really important to a kind of like repudiation of that imprisonment and insideness. And yeah, precisely to your point about, you know, the project of Black living being one of like refusing confinement and refusing enclosure. It feels like that's exactly what your photographs are doing, is refusing the inside.
Thank you. Can we ask the audience members to ask questions and contribute? Do we have to do microphones? You know, is it okay without? Okay, please.
I want to make a comment about color because it's from what you showed, David, it seemed to be one of the striking elements that you're adding to this and altering. I was also struck in when Zoe showed the skill from the Senegalese black color, and I suppose the whole color thing came to me because, well, I'm interested in color, but also suddenly I thought, wait a second, I had a transformative experience when finally, after seeing probably 10 screenings of the Sembene in black and white. I saw a reconstructed color version. It was originally shot in color. And actually it produces a completely, well, it really adds another dimension because the time in Africa, she's like a fashion girl. And you get this interest of in fabric, in design, etc. before she. So the whole thing, I urge you to see it in color.
You know where I can find it?
I was like stunned, when I. But then, and this is very early for African film to be shot in color. I believe. So I urge you to look at that again because it really gave me at least a different impression of the film and who she was before she's enslaved in Antique. So I really, she's a complete fashion girl. It was almost like a fashion movie for the first 15 minutes. And I was struck also by the role of color in David's work. But here's my really dumb question, I'm a photo historian. It was as this began that I suddenly turned to Rich next to the next to me and went, wait a second. In the 1935 exhibit for which Walker Evans did the photographs, did they even show the sculptures or only the photographs? Can someone tell me?
The sculptures.
They did sculptures.
Yeah, they did a traveling show of the photographs, but also this one. They're two separate traveling shows.
What was of the sculpture?
One was a selection of the actual sculptures that they could extend loans for and travel, and then Evans.
Then the cheap version was the photos. So they were not together.
No, but he produced a portfolio of around 450 photographs out of the 600 objects that were 17 portfolios that were donated to NYU has one. Schomburg Center has one. So there's 17 versions of 450 that were distributed. Some for free, donated, and then others by subscription.
So I guess I would sort of move from that to say that it seems to me that documentary style is for Evans at this time black and white, and it's about the removal of color. And one of the things I haven't seen the book yet or this work, but except for what you showed, is transforming it with color. That then gets back to this new book, which I've always started to be black and blue, but to really think about color in terms of both African and diasporic aesthetics, but also, Terry Job, but what about Benjamin and talking about photography's desacralization of objects? So those are just things
Small potatoes.
Yeah, I struggled with color for a long time. When I was in grad school, I still think I have a hard time thinking about color in a descriptive way when it comes to trying to think through describing an event, a person, a place. I've always struggled with color. I think it's because of so much of my learning how to make compelling pictures was through black and white photography. I think that's part of it, but also through thinking about color in this more emotive way. Like if you could describe how a picture, so to sort of contextualize the emotional or sort of psychological space that a picture puts you in, rather than using the color to tell you what a thing looks like, has been more useful for me. So in a lot of my pictures, I'm using these kind of photographs, these kind of textiles, and the way I'm using color and the way I'm using apparatus in the studio is a way to sort of contextualize the pictures in my the event of looking, but I'm not trying to use color to tell you, oh, what if I were to sort of, you know, ask what this thing might look like, you know, in person, right? To sort of like maybe reimagine all those like neoclassical like sculptures, you know, it's not like just like white marble or like bronze, you know? In a similar way to these kind of like African sculptures, I mean, like, you know, a lot of them will be wood tone or natural tones, but some of them are painted, you know? And for me, I think that it's something that it's definitely like, you know, as an artist, you're always thinking about what moves left or what moves are left on the board, you know, a little bit. And that is definitely something I think about. But in a lot of my work over the past few years, I've been thinking about color as an opportunity to code an image or sort of contextualize an image outside of the color being used to describe what it might look like, you know? And it's just progression. I'll learn how to use color, like eventually, you know? But for me, it's more useful as a sort of conceptual tool than like as like a documentary sort of descriptor. So, but yeah, maybe when I start making more sort of moving image, I'll become more interested in color as like the sort of descriptive potential of color, you know, but I just love black and white photography. It's so good. So
I think we would love to have one more question. Yes.
hmm.
In a way that would clear, as we talk about inside and outside, I kind of felt like, you use your outsider, spirit, to create or recreate something, that had been done with an inside. So, I guess my question is, don't you think already using them to document?
Well, I think that maybe it's because in photography the whole game is just different. You know, I feel like when it with photography, this question, oh man, I remember these crits in grad school. Why is this one in black and white? Why is this one in color? You know, and for me, I had started to think. I remember at one point I had a room just like full of blue photographs, like all the photographs were blue, you know, because I like wanted to use blue as like an opportunity to really like speak to how this color was making people feel, you know. And for a while I was like using color as a means to sort of talk about you know, the way that like we use color in flags to sort of you know, think about like nation states or communities, you know, like colors as like signifiers. But as a photographer, you're always thinking about like, how do I do my job? Like I relate to being a working, like a hired gun. I'm a, you know, like I relate to that. And I feel like, you know, as a photographer, you're constantly like thinking about that. And sometimes the color is, it's so loud that it's difficult for me to find a way to draw something in a way that feels like how I feel in that moment, and to use it more like in this abstract way or painterly way that is it's very different from photography, you know? Like for a while I was, I remember working as an art handler on one of Barbara Caston's shows in Chicago. And the way that color was being used in her work was, I think, really formative for me also. Just like the idea that you can use color in a more poetic way rather than in a way that is like mise-en-scene, that's like describing the thing, you know? And then it also gives me the opportunity to like slow down and figure out what I'm doing, what I'm trying to say, you know? Because making art is hard, you know? I'd rather like work with like red, black, and green for a while than I work with blue for a while, you know? Yeah, I think for me, I can get to something that is at least also causes a more collective experience for a viewer than like the ability to sort of you know augment history, right? Like if I were to take a bunch of black and white images and hand color them, that's it for me exciting because it is a sort of it's actively sort of augmenting the original history, you know? When I'm much more interested right now in dealing with loss, you know, and trying to, it seems like so much of my work has been about grappling with like photography and loss, you know, and the sort of the joy of expression that could come out of that for me. And so, yeah, I mean, like I said, I'll figure out the color stuff.
Well, thank you to all of the panelists, and I think we can continue the conversation now in the reception right across the hall. Thank you again.